All right, lots to get across. Joining me now, as he does every Monday, the Australian's national editor, Dennis Shanahan. Dennis, thank you, as always. I wrote yesterday in my newspaper column in the Sunday papers that I reckon last week was by far the worst week for the government since it was elected. How would you assess it?
Well, Peter, I wouldn't be unsurprised to agree with you, given I jumped the gun a bit in the Australian and said last Wednesday it was the worst sitting week since the election. It is clearly the worst parliamentary performance we've seen. The whole toxic issue of Anthony Albanese's overseas travel came to boiling point. He wasn't there. The Minister for Immigration and the Minister for Home Affairs hadn't prepared for the huge decision by the High Court. The decision since, the arguments about it, including the Prime Minister's today, are inconsistent, they're illogical, they're almost risible in the lack of logic they're applying just to argue because they failed to actually have precautionary legislation ready. But they got caught out legislatively and politically by Peter Dutton. And then we had, on top of that, just to make things worse for Anthony Albanese in San Francisco at APEC, the decision by the government not to release the information about the injury to naval divers as a result of Chinese sonar being directed towards them underwater. And then now the Prime Minister is caught in a whole web of who did he tell, when did he tell it, who knew what, when. And so I think last week was definitely the worst week for the Labor government. And I think that the next sitting week is going to be a real test for Anthony Albanese's leadership. I don't mean that in a sense that he would face any challenge. I mean a challenge to his leadership ability to actually set up the government to reset and get back onto a positive agenda, or the Labor Party is going to go into this long Christmas break with a very bad outlook for next year.
You're right to mention that the lines today from the Prime Minister just aren't plausible. This idea, he says, Peter Dutton was there for 6 years. He did nothing about this High Court decision. Well, the warning only came in June. They've been there in June. Peter Dutton wasn't there in June. They've had since June until November to come up with a plan B. They clearly did not have them. You have this issue with the Chinese. The incursion happened last Tuesday. Well, the PM was in the Parliament on Tuesday. He could have done a statement to the Parliament. So could the Foreign Minister, as would be usual. Neither did. He then goes to San Francisco. He meets on the sidelines with Xi. He leaves the impression he might have discussed it, but you heard those comments, the bit of the royal we. Well, leaders use we when they don't mean me, and that was very clear from that comments I listened to the Prime Minister. He is not admitting he raised anything with Xi. And so you've got, I think, a trifecta of woe. You've got the voice defeat, you've got this issue now over the weekend with the Chinese, and of course you've got the detainees from last week. And you don't feel at the moment, as people are looking at them, and these three things have really cut through with voters, as people are looking at the government, you don't feel that this is a Prime Minister in charge of the ship. That's my sense of it.
Well, that's precisely right. And as I said in the Australian last week, what actually happened was that Peter Dutton took over the legislative and political agenda in the Australian Parliament and the Australian government. He was operating from the Leader of the Opposition's office while Anthony Albanese was absent. The government had to capitulate completely to Peter Dutton legislatively and politically because they had not prepared for it. They underestimated the public impact of having 93 criminals, some including hideous crimes being committed, and yet they didn't seem to think that the public would be upset. They certainly didn't think that there needed to be any precaution legislation prepared. And let's remember that Julia Gillard suffered a big loss at the High Court when she proposed her Malaysian people swap. Same issue, Prime Minister, Who was the immigration
remember it
minister?
well.
Chris Bowen. Chris Bowen, Anthony Albanese, Tony Burke, they were in the cabinet. And here they are now saying, oh, well, we didn't think we'd have to prepare precautionary legislation. It is almost unbelievable that they could not calculate that the High Court was going to make an adverse decision, even if there was only a chance that they would. This issue was so serious that they just seemed to think that releasing 93 criminals wasn't going to be too upsetting for the community. And they didn't think of the impact on people.
I agree with that last point. They didn't think of the impact on people, but I think on the issue of detention, as we saw with the Malaysian solution, as we saw last week, the issue of detention inside the Labor caucus, particularly on the left, it's dynamite. And I think they'd rather, bury their head under the doona and hope that the High Court doesn't land them with a detention conundrum to sort of resolve. I think they'd rather that than try internally, have a plan B, have those debates and risk, I guess, division. I mean, we've got the reshuffle season almost upon us with summer. All this talk about Linda Burney, he has to do something about her. So says the commentariat. I think he does too, though, given her pretty shocking performance during the Voice referendum. He's now got this issue in that portfolio. Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neill, Immigration Minister Andrew Giles. I mean, they're neck and neck to see who's the worst performer in the portfolio. Colleagues seem restless. What do you think he's going to do?
Well, this is the traditional time. It's halfway through the term. It's just before Christmas. And what Prime Ministers tend to do, if they do want to reset, and Anthony Albanese has to reset, he has to shake up his team, he has to make them perform better, he has to find an excuse to have a reshuffle. And of course, Linda Burney, the Voice wasn't even carried in her own electorate. She has indicated she's had health issues and so forth, so it may well be that Linda Burney could be the one who is moved aside, which then provides the reason for a reshuffle. And so that way you can then start to change people around. But the danger for the Prime Minister is that there are so many ministers who haven't performed well in their portfolio that changing the chairs doesn't necessarily make it better. But it is a step forward, and I think this is something that he must consider, and he must consider before Christmas to give any new ministers the chance of that long summer break to settle into their portfolios. Some of them haven't settled into the portfolio in the first 18 months, so they'll need a bit of a break to do so over summer.
We will watch with interest, Dennis Shanahan. Thank you.